everyone agrees in an organization on one thing, that company is going to die. Like, you need
Yes.
people arguing different things. You need people challenging each other. The question is, how do you do that in a way that doesn't destroy the connection we have to each other?
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Sundays with Vernā. And we have an incredible show for you today with Charles Duhigg, who's going to talk to us about all things super communicators. So I want to just welcome you, Charles, to Sundays with Vernā.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And you and I first met because you are a character. There's a whole chapter in Super Communicators about you. And I have to say, coming and spending time with you at Netflix was one of the most fun chapters to write. Like
Oh, you say
you and your stuff.
super
No, it's true.
communicators.
It's true. I like that. After the first time I met you, I went home and I told my wife, I've just met the most charismatic woman I've ever encountered.
Oh, you're
It
so
was
sweet, Charles.
such a delight.
Okay, before we get into all this, I do need to tell my listeners who you are, right? Charles didn't just stop by. Charles is like a 3-time New York Times best-selling author. That's quite an accomplishment. I mean, when you've got The Power of Habit, which I guess was translated in 40 different languages now, right? You've got Smarter, Faster, Better, and now Super Communicators.
Yeah.
That's run, Mr. Duhigg.
Well, it's been fun. It's been fun. I have to say, it's as a reporter, the thing you most hope for is that people will actually read what you write. So,
Yes,
as you know, as an author yourself, it's just so rewarding when you hear from people who feel like something touched their lives.
absolutely. And you write in such a way that has both like the theory and the research, but also the pragmatic or practical takeaways. And I thought that was absolutely true in Super Communicators as well. So
Yeah.
you talk about like what makes for a real communicator. Like, what are they thinking about, and what are they aware of that you found are common to super communicators?
Yeah. So there's a handful of things. And the biggest thing that researchers have found is an understanding that conversations have structures, right? So most people, when they sit down and have a discussion, they assume that that discussion is about one thing, right? But actually, what researchers have found is that every discussion is made up of different kinds of conversations. And these kinds of conversations, they tend to fall into one of three buckets. There's there's practical conversations where we're making plans together or we're solving problems. But then there's emotional conversations where I might tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize, and I want you to listen to me. And then there's social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other, how we relate to society, the identities that are important to us. And what researchers have found is that when we're having all three of those conversations are equally legitimate. And in one discussion, we might move through all three of them. But if you and I are having different kinds of conversations at the same moment, if you bring up something emotional and I try and solve your problem in a practical sense, then we literally won't be able to hear each other fully. And we certainly won't feel connected to each other. And so what's become known within psychology is the matching principle that says successful communication requires having the same kind of conversation at the same moment. And super communicators are pretty good at trying to ask themselves, what kind of conversation is happening right now? How can I match this person or invite them to match me?
It's so powerful. I think, especially when you're in those difficult conversations, and lots seems to be at stake, right? Often people are trying to make the conversation what they want it to be.
Exactly.
Uh, yeah, and that is like a dead end, and it starts to really unravel very quickly. Like, I don't want to hear your feelings,
Yeah,
or somebody might be like, I need to share this, the impact of this, and how I feel as a person from this generation or whatever. And either a person can like lean into that and match it, like you said, or they'll be like, I don't think that's relevant.
totally, totally. Or it'll feel like an attack to them, right? And
Yes.
oftentimes it's because we don't understand there's these different kinds of conversations. And so, my habit might be to fall back on practical conversations. And we find particularly this happens. Men are habituated in practical conversations. women are as well, but oftentimes women get a lot more training and experience with emotional conversations, and so they're just more comfortable with it. Not that there's any difference between the genders in our brains, just it's a matter of like sort of what we're comfortable and experienced with. And oftentimes just asking makes all the difference. And there's been a lot of research that I know you're familiar with. This woman, Kiara Sanchez, who's at Dartmouth now, like she did a bunch of studies about what do people worry about when they talk about race in particular. And she found that white people will get in their own heads because they're worried they're going to accidentally say something racist. And their friends and colleagues who are people of color, particularly Black, because that's what she studied, they will get in their own heads because they're worried that their friend is going to accidentally say something racist. Everyone has the exact same worry, but because we don't want to voice that, because we don't want to say, like I might say the wrong thing, we get so focused on what we're saying as opposed to listening to the other person that it becomes really, really hard for us to, even if we want to communicate, it becomes hard for us to do it.
Thank you for bringing that up, especially the listening part. And the listening without forming an argument or an
Exactly.
opinion or trying to keep your fears at bay. See.
No, it's not. It's not at all. And it can feel like walking through a minefield. And now that being said, there are a couple of skills. We mentioned that,
Yes.
super. So let me go through two of them in particular that I think really help in this respect. The first is one of the things that we know consistent super communicators do is that they ask more questions than the average person, a lot more questions. And some of the questions they ask are special. They're what's known within psychology as deep questions. And a deep question is something that asks me about my values or my beliefs or my experiences. And that can sound a little intimidating, but it's like as simple as like if you meet someone who's a doctor, say, instead of saying, oh, what hospital do you work at? Saying, oh, what made you decide to go to medical school? Right. That second question, what made you decide to go to medical school? What it does is it invites the other person to talk about their beliefs, to talk about their experiences. They might say something like, when I was a kid, I saw my dad get sick and I saw the doctors as these healers and I wanted to be one of them. So that's someone who they're not in a practical mindset. They might be talking about emotions. They might even be talking about this might be a social conversation about the roles that we play and the identities that are important to us. And so asking those questions, genuinely curious questions, is really, really useful. In fact, there's this saying I love, which is, if you're feeling furious, get curious. Because what it does is it reminds us,
too.
right? When we're all fired up, when we're thinking about like what I'm going to say and I'm going to tell you how it is. And instead of doing that, I'm really upset. I'm going to ask you genuinely curious questions. Like I'm going to ask you questions. And then when we ask those questions, that's the first skill, is asking deep questions. The second skill is proving that we're listening. Because oftentimes we think listening just means opening up our ears, but as you know better than anyone, listening is not just opening up your ears, it's proving to the other person that you're paying attention. And sometimes that means that you're asking follow-up questions. Sometimes that means that you're sharing about your own experiences. Sometimes it means you're doing this thing called looping for understanding, where you ask a deep question, step one, you repeat back what you heard the person say in your own words, step two, and then step three is you ask if you got it right. Because when I ask you, what I hear you say is this, am I hearing you correctly? Am I getting that? What I'm actually doing is I'm asking you for permission to acknowledge that I've been listening. And that makes the conversation so much better.
And so much more interesting. Like deep questions really are so interesting. So, for example, if you're like a person who doesn't like chit chat and doesn't want to go to those stand around cocktail parties,
Yeah.
but if you get good at asking deep questions, it's a party. Like you are really learning so many cool things. It's quite fulfilling. And people become more interesting, and then you feel connected to them, and then who knows what the possibilities are.
And by the way, they like talking to you more, right? Because like you're asking them interesting questions about themselves. And the thing about a deep question that's really nice is there's something unique about them, which is that it's very natural to answer our own question after we've asked a deep question. So if I ask you, why'd you go to medical school? And you say, because I saw my dad get sick. It's very natural for me to say, oh, I became a lawyer because I saw an uncle of mine get arrested when I was a kid, and I thought that that was really unfair. And now, if I had said lawyers and doctors have a lot in common, you would say, no, they don't, right? Like, but yet we have found something we have in common because when I ask a deep question and you answer it, it's very natural for me to answer my own question and very graceful. It doesn't feel like I'm forcing something into the conversation. It feels like a back and forth and a give and take.
That actually reminds me of one of the exercises I think I shared with you when at Netflix, where we would just do like 3 questions that everyone had to answer, right? And it would be like, how do you identify or what's the most important identification for you and why, right? And there are just so many amazing stories and so many ways that your mind starts expanding. But in addition, it's like the connectivity, right?
Yeah.
Because you're noticing some commonalities that you didn't expect. And you're actually sometimes seeing differences that you didn't expect either. And it just becomes like a real authentic exchange
Yeah.
instead of something that's superficial. And when you have more authenticity, when real problems come, difficult problems come, you feel like I kind of know this person,
Yeah.
or I can kind of understand why they're reacting this way.
Absolutely. And what I love about the questions you just mentioned is they're inviting people to say something meaningful without mandating that they say something
Yes.
meaningful, right? Like
Yes.
what identity is important to you? It's very easy for me to say like, "Oh, I'm a dad." Like that's
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Or I could say actually, as a white man who grew up in New Mexico where like most of my school was 89% Hispanic and so like I sort of felt like an outsider, but ever since then I haven't been an outsider. Like it's an invitation rather than a mandate to say something meaningful.
Yes.
But can I
Yes.
ask you a question on this
Yeah.
about how people sometimes I imagine right now there are some people that you encounter who they ask, "What do you work on?" And you say, "Oh, I'm a consultant and I work in, helping bring diversity and inclusion to organizations." And there are probably some people who are like, "Oh, you're one of those people, right?" Like their hackles go up, they're ready because I feel like DEI, there's a a majority of the nation that feels like DEI is a bad word. What do you do assuming that person is well-intentioned, assuming that they are someone who just they have a preconception that's making it hard for them to connect. What do you do in that situation?
Oh, well, it's such an interesting question because for a long time when I would be on a plane and someone would ask me what I would do, and I would say, I'm a consultant. I advise companies about building like inclusive and diverse workplaces. They would go, what? Well, you're like, okay. But then it became a thing where I think more people kind of understood it, even if they didn't know the words for it. I would say that, right now, DEI is still actually, all the studies say, actually really respected by most people.
Yeah.
It's just that we have some very loud voices right now that are really trying to demean all of that work. But if that I encountered someone who said something derogatory about it, I would take a deep breath because I believe in breathing. And I would say, my go-to question is, "What do you mean?"
Yeah.
Or "Why do you ask that?" Or I might say something like, "Wow, I didn't expect that reaction. Tell me why." I try to remain curious and give the person the benefit of the doubt because often when people are saying these things, I mean, there are some mean people, right, who are like intentionally trying to stab you. But a lot of people say things that are painful to hear, but they have no idea how
Yeah.
painful it is or what they're doing by saying it that way or asking in that particular way. And my other favorite thing to do, and, because I have written this book, What If I Say the Wrong Thing? And also have done a lot on like not like interrupting bias, which is I say, well, do you mind if I tell you about my experience or why I do this or why this is important to me? And then usually they're like, Yeah, sure. And then I will share my perspective.
Yeah,
But like you said in the book, and what I have learned is you're not trying to win that argument.
exactly.
So
And
tell us more about that, like what the goals are and how that
well,
matters.
what I love about what you just said is these two responses. The first is to kind of be curious and ask, like, "What? Tell me why you ask that, or why do you think that?" Or like that's a genuinely curious question, right? And I think it disarms the other person. Or to ask permission, "Can I tell you about my experience?" Because what you're not saying is you're not saying, "Let me tell you all the stats. Like I can prove that I'm right and you're wrong." By instead, what you're saying is, "Let me just tell you about my experience because you are an expert on your own experiences, and the person listening to you is an expert on their own experiences, right? So you're coming into this conversations as equals, and that's
Yes.
really important to be equals."
Equals are I agreed wholeheartedly. One of the things, one of the reasons why that exercise I mentioned really works, because everybody gets the same amount of time uninterrupted to tell a story. And it's so rare that anyone listens to us uninterrupted for any period of
Absolutely,
time, right? But
absolutely.
it also is great for the listener because they have been told they can't interrupt, so it's more likely that they will actually stay train their attention on this person. But the other thing that I sometimes do is, depending on the tone coming at me, is just like you said, what kind of conversation is this? Like, if the tone is emotional, I'm not gonna go to the intellectual.
Right.
Right? I'm not gonna spin out the stats, right? I'm going to say something like, "It sounds like you're furious," or, "It sounds like you're really upset. Tell me why," or, "What's
Yeah.
bothering you," or whatever. So you give us, like, really some good tips and things, ways to practice this. So what can you share with the audience about a couple of really good tips for
Yeah.
enhancing your ability to communicate?
So we've talked about a couple of them. Is it paying
Yeah.
attention to what kind of conversation is happening, asking deep questions, proving that you're listening. But then the last one is, and this is very this draws on, I had mentioned Kiara Sanchez, who's done a lot of work on this as an academic, and it draws, I think, on the work that you did at Netflix. One of the things that's really effective, you mentioned, sometimes we make these small mistakes and they can hurt other people in ways that we don't even anticipate. I think in the hardest conversations, the best thing we can do is to start them by saying, "This is gonna be a hard conversation." I just wanna say at the outset, I want to acknowledge this is gonna be awkward. Like, I'm sorry it's gonna be awkward, but it's actually the reason why it's so important for us to have this is because it's awkward. And by the way, I'm probably gonna say the wrong thing, right? Like, the gap between my brain and my lips is so short that I'm gonna say something and it's gonna come out wrong and it's gonna sound offensive, and I want you to know I'm not trying to offend you. Like, I hope you will forgive me, and I promise you, if you say the wrong thing, I will forgive you, right? Just by taking that off the table, by saying, let's acknowledge that this is weird and this is hard and we might make mistakes, that changes the entire tenor of the conversation. Because at that moment, instead of waiting for you to do the thing that I'm worried you're going to do, waiting for you to say something accidentally racist or to say something instead, and then and either like shying away from it or maybe pouncing on it because this is my chance to like prove to you, we've taken all the sting out of those moments. And so instead we can just genuinely listen to each other. And I think that's something, the more we talk about a conversation in a conversation, the better that conversation's going to go.
Wow. I love that. The thing is that you kinda have to be present, and a lot of people aren't quite as present as they need to be to even recognize, like, when they've stepped in it. But, yeah, laying out this, like, the awkwardness and the difficulty, and I've really been encouraging people that they can do this, that they can
Yeah.
have a hard conversation, and that they shouldn't expect it not to be hard.
Right.
That they should actually just, make a little space in there. It's gonna be a little weird, it's gonna be a little hard, and we can do it because these are the most important ones. These are the
Absolutely.
ones. And then the other thing that I love what you're saying is I've learned to do this too, which is to say, "Oh, shoot. was that wrong? Did I step in it? Like, in the moment. And that all of a sudden, like, gives you more air, right? The person will be like, "No, it's okay," or, "Yeah, I really prefer if you don't use that." Like,
Yeah.
yeah. Or, in the guidelines that we had ouch and oops too.
Yeah.
And those were like in the moment kind of things where you could just be like, ouch. It's a little bit of some feedback, but it's not like you're a terrible person type feedback.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and it makes it easy, and particularly it makes it easy for the other person to say, "Oops," to say like, "Oh, I
Yes.
didn't I didn't mean to upset you." Like, we've got this little thing that allows us to make us it's kinda like taking a long conversation, putting it in a suitcase where, like, you can register your discomfort. I can register that, like, "I apologize. That was not what I meant."
Yes.
And all we
Yes.
have to do is say 2 words, and it takes the air out of the fight, right?
Yeah.
Because the truth of the matter is, if we are having this conversation, if it's hard and it's weird, the reason we're usually having it is because we really need to, and because we know we're gonna feel so much better afterwards, right? We're gonna feel closer
And
to each other.
yes, and if we don't, it's gonna ultimately get ugly. Like, it's
Yes.
going to
If you don't have
really
that
rob
conversation.
yeah, that exactly, and that's what people don't understand, I think, just, like, largely, like, on a team, at a company, in the country, it's that if you could a lot of people wanna sweep things under the rug, and I understand that, I understand why, but ultimately, it comes back to bite you, or ultimately it causes such distrust and such psychologically, people just cannot feel safe. And therefore, you can't achieve the kind of collaboration that you need. And I think that is a really important reason why people should work on trying to be better communicators. And I always say that to people, especially when I'm saying it's going to be hard, but you're going to be building some muscles, which
Yeah.
means that the next conversation usually is not as hard. Or you have some tools, you have some things that worked, you have some things that did not work at the last conversation. And I'm
Yes.
always going to be, as a result, more attentive
Yeah, and
to
and
who you
and you're
are.
never gonna find a situation where everyone walks away in agreement, right? Be
Right.
because that's not the goal of a company. If everyone agrees in an organization on one thing, that company is gonna die. Like, you need
Yes.
people arguing different things. You need people challenging each other. The question is, how do you do that in a way that doesn't destroy the connection we have to each other? And a lot of it is that communication. If I can connect with you through language, if I can communicate with you, then if
Yes.
we understand why we disagree, then the disagreement doesn't become an existential crisis. It becomes just a disagreement.
Thank you so much for the contribution of this book. And I
Thank
really
you.
encourage everybody to go out and get it and read it and start practicing the tips. I know I read like the piece about deep questions, and the next day I was on a plane and it was practicing on random people. I was doing deep questions. It was fun. But I also realized, ooh, you need to brush up on your deep questions. Like
Oh,
you,
interesting.
because you, you have to have your brain, you kind of have to shift your brain a bit to come up with that question instead of the one that you would normally ask.
Right.
Instead, you gotta be like, okay, what would be a deep question about that? You
It's a
know?
habit, right? It's a
Yeah.
habit we get into, and the more we practice it, the more that habit becomes easier and easier to access.
Yes, you're going back to the habit book, so that makes a lot of sense. So, thank you so much for being a guest on Sundays with Vernā. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you for having me. This has been such a treat.
Thanks for joining us. Be sure to follow me at Vernā Myers on Instagram and Twitter. You can also listen to my podcast on Spotify and Apple Music. Subscribe to my channel and share this episode with someone who is going to join us in this space. Make sure to visit my website for DEI resources and online learning courses at vernamyers.com. And make sure you sign up for my newsletter to stay in touch with me. Thank you again for listening, and see you next time for more Sundays with Vernā.